There are moments when a person leaves a discussion with the unsettling sensation that, although everything was said, nothing was truly gained. The words that were spoken echo like hollow shells, and instead of strength, what remains is an emptiness, as though the very act of defending oneself drained away power. Many people know this feeling. It is the sense of being surrounded by loud voices, by interruptions, by arrogance wearing the mask of confidence, and walking away with the impression that silence meant defeat. This belief has been carefully planted into the human mind. From a young age, society teaches that silence is weakness. The person who remains quiet is told that they have surrendered, that they have lost the battle. The one who argues the most fiercely is praised for strength. Yet what if this entire narrative is false? What if true mastery lies not in speech, but in the deliberate choice not to respond? To understand this idea requires courage, because it challenges the foundation of what most people have been taught to believe. Nietzsche was among the rare voices who dared to confront this illusion. He saw through the noise of endless debate and recognized a deeper truth. Those who talk without restraint reveal far more than they should. Those who feel compelled to justify themselves have already surrendered ground. Words, when thrown around recklessly, are not signs of strength. They are signs of insecurity. The need to convince is not power, but an admission of doubt. Silence, on the other hand, unsettles precisely because it is not an admission. It is presence itself. Consider for a moment the effect of silence in the midst of noise. A room filled with chatter feels normal until someone refuses to add to it. That stillness cuts through the air like a blade because it is not empty, it is full. It forces the other person to hear themselves more clearly than they desire. It compels them to confront their own fragility without the comfort of your reassurance or your reaction. In that absence, they reveal themselves. They speak more than necessary. They expose their fears. Human beings have been conditioned to confuse silence with submission, but Nietzsche pointed to another possibility. Silence can be the highest form of self-mastery. When a person does not react, it is not because they are defeated, but because they are free from the need to prove anything. It is an expression of inner strength, not weakness. True victory, he argued, does not come from winning a verbal contest. It comes from being so centered in one's own truth that the contest itself becomes irrelevant. Why then does silence disturb so deeply? Because most people speak not to share wisdom, but to defend fragile egos. They mistake disagreement for attack, and they lash out in order to preserve their identity. Every word becomes a shield, every explanation an armor against insecurity. In such a battlefield, the quiet observer wields the sharpest weapon. By refusing to join the chaos, the silent one remains untouchable. The reactive mind is always at a disadvantage. It is tied to the impulses of others, chained by the need to respond, pulled in every direction by the demand for validation. The observing mind, however, is dangerous because it is not controlled by external forces. It watches, it learns, it holds back until the perfect moment. In that patience lies the essence of power. The first to shout may feel dominant, but in truth, they have already exposed themselves. To remain silent in the face of provocation is not passivity. It is a decision. It is a declaration that you are not bound to the expectations of others. It is the refusal to play a game designed to steal your strength. Silence in this light is not absence. It is a formidable presence. It is the sound of inner authority, an authority that does not need to be spoken to be felt. Silence does not simply remain in the background. It shapes the entire environment around it. The person who resists the urge to react changes the rhythm of the interaction. Others expect confrontation. They anticipate rebuttals. They prepare their counterattacks. When these expected responses do not come, the entire framework of the discussion collapses. Silence disrupts the script. It leaves others disoriented, unsure of how to continue. This is why silence carries a weight that speech often cannot achieve. It refuses to play along with the assumptions of ordinary dialogue. Nietzsche described this condition as liberation from herd morality. Herd morality is the state of living under the constant shadow of approval, the endless desire to be perceived as good, correct, and just in the eyes of others. It is the morality of conformity, of bending oneself to meet collective expectation. Silence, when chosen with intention, severs that dependence. It asserts independence from the applause or rejection of the crowd. It states clearly, without words, that your value does not require their agreement. This is not an easy path. To stand silently in the face of laughter, ridicule, or criticism requires a steadiness that most people do not possess. It is natural to want to explain oneself, to defend one's reputation, to ease the discomfort of misunderstanding. But Nietzsche insisted that strength is not demonstrated by the ability to win arguments. Strength is demonstrated by the ability to remain unshaken, even when the entire world fails to understand you. The refusal to justify oneself is a declaration of sovereignty. The world is a theater of arguments. People enter discussions not with the intention of reaching truth, but with the desire to dominate. They cling to their positions because those positions protect fragile identities. Every justification is a shield against collapse. In such a theater, words often conceal more than they reveal. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest. It is usually the most insecure. The one who observes quietly holds the true advantage, for their silence exposes the desperation of those around them. Imagine the dynamic of power when silence is employed with precision. The manipulator thrives on reaction, feeding on emotional responses to strengthen control. But when no reaction is given, the manipulator is deprived of nourishment. They become restless, anxious, and eventually reveal the weakness they intended to conceal. Silence is not just a shield against manipulation. It is a blade that cuts the foundation upon which manipulation depends. Without your response, the structure of their game collapses. Psychology confirms this phenomenon. Studies show that silence in confrontational situations is perceived as judgment. The human brain, deprived of external validation, begins to fill the silence with its own fears. The amygdala activates, producing anxiety, self-doubt, and suspicion. The one who remains quiet is perceived as powerful, not because of any spoken claim, but because the other person projects their own insecurities onto the silence. It is an invisible mirror reflecting what they do not wish to see. This mirror effect explains why silence is so often feared. Words allow people to disguise themselves, to mask insecurity, to hide behind arguments and explanations. Silence strips away those coverings. When you do not respond, you force others to hear their own noise. The emptiness between their words and their true selves becomes louder than anything you could have said. Silence removes the veil and leaves them exposed. For Nietzsche, this was not merely a tactic in conversation. It was a way of life. To embrace silence as strength is to free oneself from the tyranny of reaction. It is to cultivate inner mastery that cannot be disturbed by external voices. Silence in this sense is not void. It is presence, authority, and unwavering control. It is the embodiment of a spirit that no longer lives for acceptance, but for its own truth. Such silence transforms not only discussions, but existence itself. The power of silence grows even more profound when it is connected with the figure Nietzsche called the Übermensch, or the Overman. This figure represents the human being who rises above conventional morality and the demands of society. The Overman does not live to please, to convince, or to conform. He does not waste his strength in endless attempts to prove himself to others. Instead, he cultivates absolute self-mastery, and it is through this mastery that his silence becomes an unmistakable force. The silence of the Overman is not emptiness. It is command. It is the weight of presence that needs no decoration. When others attempt to draw him into petty quarrels, he does not descend. He does not scramble to defend himself, or to argue for recognition. His refusal to participate in trivial disputes creates a tension that unsettles everyone around him. His silence carries a statement that is louder than any word. I do not need your validation. This silence is not passive. It is alive, deliberate, and charged with intention. It is an energy that shapes the room, that dictates the rhythm of interaction, that forces others to reckon with their own fragility. When others fill the air with explanations and defenses, the silent one watches with clarity. Every word spoken by the other becomes a revelation. Contradictions appear, hidden fears surface, arrogance begins to crumble. The overman does not need to attack, because the other defeats themselves in the space carved out by silence. The ordinary person often confuses speech with strength. They rush to fill silence with arguments, believing that noise will protect them. Yet each word spoken is a move revealed. Each emotional reaction is an opening displayed. The silent individual wastes nothing. No move is revealed prematurely. No weakness is exposed through impulse. Silence in this way becomes the ultimate economy of power. It is not about withholding because there is nothing to say. It is about withholding because not every truth deserves to be offered to every ear. The presence of this type of silence is unsettling precisely because it breaks predictable patterns. People do not know what to expect. They cannot measure the silent one in the same way they measure others who eagerly reveal their thoughts. This unpredictability inspires caution, and caution creates respect. The silent one becomes the gravitational center of the interaction. Others adjust themselves around the quiet presence, altering their words, softening their tone, revealing insecurity. Silence bends the dynamics of power without force. To reach this level of silence requires discipline. It demands resisting the inner voice that screams to react, to defend, to be understood. It requires the death of the need for approval. Only when a person no longer feels compelled to justify themselves can their silence become pure authority. Otherwise, silence risks becoming submission, a mask for fear. The silence of the overman is not submission. It is sovereignty. This sovereignty is terrifying to those who live dependent on recognition. It cannot be manipulated by guilt, nor swayed by fear, nor controlled through shame. Such a presence cannot be touched because it does not participate in the games of domination and validation. It stands apart, creating its own values, its own path. This is why Nietzsche considered silence not simply a tool of interaction, but the very mark of a higher spirit. The overman rules not by volume, but by presence. In a society dominated by noise, those who master silence are kings. Their power is not in proving their importance, but in embodying it without words. They do not shout to be heard. They exist, and their existence alone shapes the world around them. Silence at this point ceases to be absence. It becomes a profound language of its own, a language of authority, stability, and mastery that no one can ignore. To understand the power of silence fully, one must also consider its psychological weight. Silence is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It is almost always felt as judgment. When a person remains quiet in a confrontational situation, the other begins to sense exposure. The absence of response leaves them without the comfort of control. They start to wonder what is being thought, what is being perceived, and what has already been noticed about their insecurity. In that uncertainty, fear is born. The human brain is not comfortable with ambiguity. When silence replaces expected confrontation, the brain rushes to fill the gap with assumptions. Doubt creeps in. Questions multiply. Is he judging me? Does he see through my performance? Does he know I am bluffing? The mind spirals into paranoia because silence leaves no anchor, no predictable path forward. In this way, silence activates the deepest layers of anxiety, forcing the other to wrestle with their own hidden fears. Nietzsche understood this long before psychology confirmed it. He saw that the ordinary individual is enslaved by their reactions, driven by impulse, eager to defend and to explain. They cannot tolerate silence because silence requires endurance, and endurance requires strength. To remain quiet is to resist vanity, to resist fear, and to resist the urge to prove oneself. For Nietzsche, those who could hold their silence had already transcended the chains that bound the herd. Silence also dismantles manipulation. Manipulators thrive on the emotions of others. Their strategies depend upon reaction anger, defense, guilt, or compliance. Without a reaction, a manipulator loses ground. They are left with no material to twist, no weakness to exploit. Silence breaks the cycle, leaving them stranded in their own schemes. It is the invisible weapon that cuts off their power at the root. What they expected to control becomes a mirror in which their own weakness is exposed. Yet silence is not only threatening to manipulators. It is also unsettling to ordinary egos. Many carry unresolved wounds, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of being invisible. When someone refuses to react, those old wounds awaken. The person begins to feel insignificant, powerless, ignored. What they relied upon for validation is suddenly gone, and the silence becomes unbearable. In this way, silence is not only a tool for defense, but also a force that confronts others with their deepest insecurities. This is why silence is so difficult, not only for others, but for oneself. To resist the compulsion to respond goes against everything society has conditioned. People are trained to believe that balance and maturity mean avoiding conflict at all costs, that being silent is the higher road. But Nietzsche warned against this misunderstanding. Silence can be wisdom, but it can also be submission disguised as virtue. To remain silent from fear or guilt is not mastery. It is surrender. True silence is born only when the need for approval dies. When you no longer feel obligated to defend, to explain, or to seek permission, silence becomes a presence of authority. It is not avoidance, but command. It is the silence of someone who stands firm, who does not bend to noise, who does not negotiate their worth. This is the silence that unsettles and inspires respect, the silence Nietzsche valued. In this recognition lies a challenge. Every individual must ask whether their silence is the silence of strength or the silence of weakness. One builds presence, the other erodes it. One declares independence, the other admits defeat. To master silence is to master oneself, to free oneself from the chains of reaction, and to embody a power that requires no explanation. This is the silence that reshapes the entire field of interaction without ever speaking a word. Silence, when used with awareness, becomes more than a defense. It transforms into a weapon of precision. The first step in wielding it is resisting the internal cry to react. Every impulse to justify yourself, every urge to explain. By choosing silence in those moments, you are severing that chain. This refusal to answer is not weakness. The truth does not need to be spoken to exist. The second dimension of silence is observation. While others exhaust themselves with arguments, explanations, and defenses, the silent one listens with sharp attention. Listening in this way is not waiting for your turn to speak. It is the art of hunting. Just as a predator listens for the faintest movement in the forest, the observer listens for contradictions, for slips of fear, for arrogance hiding insecurity. Every unnecessary word spoken by the other becomes material to understand them more deeply. This attentive silence grants enormous power. When the time comes to respond, if one chooses to speak at all, the words carry surgical precision. They do not wander, they do not ramble, they cut directly to the core. Such words strike with the force of authority because they are backed by restraint, by patience, by careful awareness. A single sentence delivered after silence can outweigh volumes of noisy explanation. The scarcity of speech makes the words far more valuable, Time is another weapon of silence. Most people cannot bear long pauses. They rush to fill them with chatter, unable to tolerate the tension. But the one who allows silence to extend controls the rhythm of the interaction. Each second of quiet becomes a burden on the other, a weight pressing upon their mind. In that growing discomfort, their defenses collapse. The pause becomes a stage where their insecurity performs itself. In this way, silence commands without a word. Unpredictability further strengthens silence. A person who speaks constantly reveals patterns. They become easy to anticipate, easy to read. But the one who chooses when to speak and when to remain quiet is never predictable. That unpredictability inspires caution, and caution is always linked to fear. People measure their words more carefully when they do not know what to expect. In such a situation, the silent one becomes the gravitational center, pulling the entire exchange into their orbit. Yet it is essential to distinguish this silence from passivity. True silence is not avoidance or retreat. It is active, alert, and deliberate. It is not the silence of one who hides, but of one who prepares. It is the restraint of power, not the absence of it. When the right moment arrives, when silence has already carried its weight, a single phrase can close the discussion entirely, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. However, silence is not only a tool for winning arguments. There are times when it protects the very core of a person's life. Many are manipulated daily, drained of energy, and dominated, without even realizing that their compliance is built on silence. They tell themselves they are avoiding conflict, maintaining peace, choosing maturity. In truth, they may be surrendering. Their silence, instead of power, becomes permission for others to continue taking. Nietzsche warned of this form of silence. He called it the morality of slaves, the set of values created by the weak to justify submission. It is the silence of resignation, of self-erasure, of shrinking oneself while calling it virtue. Such silence is not mastery. It is the slow destruction of one's own authority. To escape it requires the courage to face conflict when necessary and the wisdom to distinguish between silence as strength and silence as surrender. Only then can silence become a weapon of true power. The final form of silence is not submission and not avoidance. It is presence. Nietzsche described it as the silence of the warrior who has already won before the battle begins. This silence does not bend under pressure, does not apologize for existing, and does not diminish itself for acceptance. It is the silence that radiates authority without the need for noise. Such silence is born from mastery of the self, from the refusal to allow the world to dictate one's worth. When you practice this form of silence, you move from being manipulated to becoming untouchable. Others cannot shape you through guilt, fear, or rejection, because you no longer require their approval. You are no longer reacting to the world, but shaping it through your presence. Every step you take, every pause you hold, carries the weight of a person who knows who they are. This is the silence of sovereignty, the silence Nietzsche admired as the mark of the higher spirit. This transformation requires courage, because it means killing the herd within yourself. It means abandoning the morality of submission, the need to be good in the eyes of others, the desire to avoid conflict at any cost. To embody the Overman is to create your own values, to stand apart from convention, and to accept the loneliness that comes with independence. Silence is the ground upon which this independence is built. It is the declaration that you no longer live for applause. True silence is therefore not absence. It is not the void between sentences. It is pure presence, a living force that cannot be ignored. The weak shout, the insecure explain, the manipulative twist, but the silent one stands unmoved. This presence changes the direction of conversations, reshapes the tone of interactions, and commands respect without effort. Silence of this kind is not simply a tool. It is a way of being. Each of those moments was not strength, but surrender. To continue living this way is to allow others to decide for you, to speak for you, to trample your truth. Nietzsche would call this an insult to existence itself. The challenge, then, is not only to use silence, but to refine it, to kill the silence of fear, and to give birth to the silence of strength. The silence of fear hides, but the silence of strength shapes. The silence of fear surrenders space, but the silence of strength commands it. One diminishes the self, the other reveals its true power. Every individual must decide which silence they carry. When silence becomes presence, you no longer need to prove anything. You already are. This is why Nietzsche saw the Overman as rare, dangerous, and free. His silence was not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of mastery. It was not the avoidance of conflict, but the transformation of conflict into irrelevance. In his silence, he was already victorious, for he had transcended the need to fight. In the end, the lesson is clear. Words will always have their place, but silence, when born of strength, surpasses them all. To master silence is to master oneself, and to master oneself is to hold a power that cannot be taken away. In a world drowning in noise, the individual who commands silence becomes unshakable. Silence is not absence. It is the ultimate form of presence. It is the language of the strong, the mark of the wise, and the crown of those who no longer need to speak to be heard.